I was thinking about what to speak on today, and of course we've been going through a series called Freedom, and so we're talking about freedom from all different types of things: anxiety, anger, depression. Last week we talked about freedom in the midst of tragedy. I'm glad I listened to God, because in the midst of tragedy that took place this past week. And so today I felt like it was just only appropriate for us to talk about freedom from hatred, for us to talk about what, as Christians, how do we have freedom? Because we're not exempt from feeling emotions. We're connected to so many of these things that are in the world. And I think that we just need to hear what God's Word says about hatred this morning. I want to tell you this morning, I was working down in the French Quarter many years ago. And we were getting ready to go into just a brutally busy week. And I woke up one morning, and when I woke up, you've experienced this, maybe you've gone pretty hard, you're busy. Anybody been there? You're busy. And you wake up, and you've got a sore throat. And you know what's coming after that sore throat. And as kind of the day went on, my nose began to run a little bit, and I began to sneeze a little bit. And so I got to work, and everyone knew this was the busy season. I think it was Mardi Gras. Something was happening. And so we needed to be there almost all the time. And so someone looked at me and they said, "Man, I'm glad you caught it early. You better go to the doctor. And you better get something for that, because things are really getting ready to get wild and crazy." And so sure enough, I made an appointment with the doctor. Took a little time off, and I go to the doctor. And so we had talked. He did the full thing. He went and put the thing on my chest and put it on my back, and I did a lot of breathing. He looked in all my nostrils and everything. I know that's so embarrassing when people look in your nose, but he looked up in there and was digging around. And so anyway, and he looks at me and he says, "How long have you been sick? How long have you been feeling like this?" And I guess he misheard me, because I told him 2 days. And he looks at me and goes, 2 weeks? And I said, no. I said 2 days. And so without missing a beat, he just looks back at me and says, 2 days? Well, this is just going to have to run its course. And with that, he washed his hands and he walked out of the room. And that was the first time ever that I had ever been to a doctor's office and nothing was given to me, no prescription, no. I was thinking, at least like some super decongestant, something that could, get me through. And he said, "Well, it's just going to have to run its course." I'm thinking, you know how busy I am this week? It's not going to have to run its course. And so as I began to think about that, I began to think about that statement. I began to think about, it's just gotta run its course. And we say things like that when it comes to a cold, or when it comes to the stomach bug or something like that. But then there's sicknesses that happen in our day, in our lives, that you don't say it's just got to run its course. I've never heard a doctor talk about cancer and look at a patient and say, "You know what, this cancer is just going to have to run its course." I've never heard someone say anything about hepatitis or AIDS and say, "You know what, this really just needs to run its course." Have you? I've never heard someone talk about Alzheimer's, and they've said, "This Alzheimer's, we've caught it early. But you know what? It really just needs to run its course." We don't hear that, because there's some times of sicknesses that don't need to run their course, and that's a little bit about how hatred is. I think many times when we think about hating someone or something, that you know what, if I just need to let it run its course. I just need to cool down. I just need to, this hate will run its course. And I'm here to tell you this morning that hate does not run its course. It does not blow over. Hatred isn't like that. Hatred is like any other sin. It's like a cancer, and it will absolutely destroy you if you let it go on without being treated. You've got to treat hatred. You've got to have freedom from hatred. I was looking at what Charles Stanley, who's pastor of First Baptist Atlanta, said about the topic of hatred. This is what he said. He said, "One of the most destructive attitudes, if not the most destructive, for a Christian to display is hate. Because hate is a total breakdown." Can you see that? It's a total breakdown in the Christ-like attitude that we have been called to exhibit. And as we have seen this week, hate does nothing but destroy families. It's destroying communities, friendships, even churches. It brings about fear. Hatred does all these different things. And even as we think about crime, I just want to address this very, very briefly this morning. I want us to look up here and look at the crime breakdown that I came across. It's a little dark, but that's okay. I don't know if you could see up here, but there is a little pie chart. And this pie chart that I was looking at, as I was just kind of saying, this is specific to hate crimes. The FBI came out and said if we were to look at the different biases when it comes to hate crimes, if we were to look at all the different types of hate crimes, what would the statistics tell us? Well, kind of starts out low that less than 1%, but a good bit of hate crimes are about gender. 1.5% of hate crimes deal with disability. 1.8% talk about hate crimes are because of gender identity. 11.9% are because of ethnicity. You can see that over here. 18.6% are because of religion. Hate crimes dealing with religion. As I began to think about that, I thought a little bit about that quote-unquote church, the Westboro Baptist. It's really not a church, it's more of a hate organization. And I thought about that and how well that just centers in of hate. 18.6% are from sexual orientation. And then look at this. You can see it's drastically, you can just see the whole side over here is dark. 47% is racial. 47%. And this was done in a study in 2014. They looked at about 5,500 different hate crimes. And as I read this, my heart just broke over where we are as a nation. And this is crime. This is certainly crime. But I would argue that most of the destructive hate isn't necessarily in a criminal category, would you say? Most of the hate comes as a result of bitterness and resentment, holding a grudge. It comes because of broken relationships between husbands and wives. It comes because of broken relationships between sons and daughters against their parents or against one another. It becomes because of hurts, because people have experienced hate inside the church. I was talking to someone, praise God, it wasn't anyone in this congregation, but I was just chit-chatting with someone this week from another church, and some gossip began to weasel into our conversation. I was trying to veer a different course and just trying to take it in. I just remember thinking, I feel like I need to take a shower because of just the things that were brought up. I just know I don't like this gossip. I don't like this stuff that weaves hate into our churches. And it comes out of selfishness and it comes out of pride. And what I don't think we realize is that when hate is directed towards a person, that person, believe it or not, has more control over you than Jesus does. Let me say that one more time. When you allow hate to come into your life and you hate someone, you think that you're drawing a line in the sand. You think that, that you're trying to separate. But that hate makes that person have more control over you than Jesus. It means that that person has more influence in your life than Jesus. And that's where there is a problem. We think that hate burns a bridge of relationships, but let me tell you, it also builds a dungeon of torture. That's what hate does. And so this morning, I want us to take some time, just briefly, as we're going to get into God's Word. I want to ask for you to turn into your Bibles into John chapter 4 together. We're going to be in John chapter 4. I also just want to ask you to go ahead and pull out those notes in your bulletin, because we're going to take some notes this morning, and then we're going to really dive headlong into John chapter 4, and I really think that God's going to speak to you this morning based on what we'll see. And so if you've got those notes out, you might want to go ahead and look at that. I want us to, at first and foremost, we want to define hatred. We want to define this. We've been defining all these different things, anxiety and anger and depression. We've really taken some time to define these issues. And so this morning I want us to define hatred. And so here's what I want you to write down. Let's define hatred. Here it is: an attitude of disgust and opposition against someone or something. It's an attitude of disgust an opposition against someone or something. Now, here's the point that I want to make. I didn't underline this, I didn't circle this, but I want to make sure that I make this point up here. Notice that I said it is an attitude of disgust and opposition. It is not a feeling, okay? Hate is something that you choose. You can choose your attitude. You might feel anger, you might feel different other emotions, but hate is something that you can choose. It's an attitude that you choose. I want to make sure that we make that distinction. It's an attitude of disgust and opposition against someone or something. And here's what's interesting. You might think I'm crazy when I'm saying this. There are some types of hate that are good. You say, what are you thinking, Pastor Dan? Some types of hate that are good. Didn't you just say that when we hate someone, that it's like building a dungeon of torturing ourselves? Yeah, I just said that when it's directed towards a person. But I want us to know this morning that hate is disgust, it's opposition, but some types of hate are even good. Did you know God himself hates some things? In fact, you might even write down some of these passages. Amos chapter 5, the whole chapter is excellent when it's talking about this. Amos, it's an Old Testament book, chapter 5, but it essentially says this: God hates it. God hates when we live however we want to live, and then we come, like on a Sunday, and we act religious later. God can't stand that. He hates that. He is disgusted and opposed anytime that happens. He hates it when people act however they want, sin however they want, walk in, maybe on a Sunday. Of course, this is written to the Old Testament. People would walk into the temple, give their sacrifices, and you know what would happen? God said, I don't like these sacrifices. He said, they disgust me. I hate these sacrifices because you're doing whatever you want throughout the week, and then you come and you act holier than thou. He said, I hate that. He also goes on to say in that particular passage of Amos chapter 5, he looks at the people and he says, you know what else I hate? He says, I hate the noise of your songs, not the music. He says, I hate the noise. You know why he says that? Because they didn't mean it from their heart. They just like to hear their own voices. The music entertained their preferences, but it wasn't towards God. So God says, I hate it. I hate it. In fact, you might write this passage down. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19 says this. Listen to the verbiage here. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. Listen to these. A haughty eyes, that's prideful, arrogant, conceited eyes. It's interesting. Listen to the different body parts that it focuses on. So haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. So what has happened this week? God has hated that. A heart that devises wicked plans. Feet that make haste to run into evil. A false witness who breathes out lies. God hates lies. And when someone sows discord among brothers. So here we have in the book of Proverbs, God comes on the scene and says, look, I want to tell you these things that I'm hating. And I think that it's interesting. He doesn't say I hate the person, but he focuses on almost like the body part, if you will. He says, I hate it when people have conceited eyes. You ever had someone with haughty, conceited eyes? You ever had that look? You ever heard, we use the phrase, look down on someone? He talks about the eyes. A lying tongue, God hates it when we lie. He hates it when we shed innocent blood, when our heart devises wicked plans, feet that run into evil, false witnessing, all these types of things. Sowing discord among brothers. There's this picture of taking seed and walking through a field, and you're just throwing seeds of discord. God hates that. So I want to make sure that when we understand this, so we can actually model the character of Christ when we stand in opposition, when we hate wrongdoing, okay? However, we stand in complete opposition to God himself. We stand in complete opposition to God when we hate people. When we hate people, we stand in opposition to the character of Christ when we hate people. And so as we've been looking at all these different things, we've been saying, you know what, there's always seems to be a lie in these areas that we need freedom of. And so I want you to write this down. So let's define the lie. What's the lie? What's the lie that Satan has whispered into our minds and into our hearts? What's the lie that we can, even in this past week, live out if we are not careful? Here's the lie. I want you to write this down. Big word, but I think it'll work for you. Let's define the lie. The lie is this. It's the belief that you can simultaneously, okay? You might have to look up here how to spell that. Okay, simultaneously, get your spell check out. The belief that you can simultaneously love God and harbor hatred for a person. So that's the lie. The lie is, oh, I can love God, I can raise my hands for God, I can raise my children for God, I can witness for God, I can do all that, and yet harbor hatred in my heart for this person. That's the lie. The lie is that you can do both at the same time. There is nothing further from the truth. I just want to read some verses to you as we're thinking about this. 1 John 2:11 says, "But whoever hates his brother is in darkness and walks in the darkness." I don't want to walk in the darkness. It says, "and does not know where he's going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes." And so first and foremost in 1 John 2, it says, listen, if you as a believer, if you hate someone, if you hate them as a person, it says you're not walking in the light of the Lord. You are wandering in darkness. You can't do this simultaneously. Later on in the book of 1 John, it goes on in 1 John chapter 4, verse 20, it says, if anyone says, listen to this, if anyone says, I love God. When most of us, we want to say that. I love God. And hates his brother. Here's the hard words. He's a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And so God comes on the scene. He says, look, if you say that you love God, but then you hate this person, you're a liar. You're a liar. And we just saw what God says about liars. Can't stand it. And then this one, which I think is so important, Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 45. This is in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, says this, "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." This was a mindset, especially in the Old Testament. Love your neighbor, love the people around you, your clique. Love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But then Jesus comes on the scene, he says, but I say to you, he's giving them a new command, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. And what he's saying here is that says, remember, God, in his overarching grace, people who are evil, he still puts food in their mouths. He still lets them buy groceries. He still allows them to keep going. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. And he says, don't love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. He says, love your enemies. And don't stop there, but pray for your enemies. And so what we can see even from these passages, even with defining the lie, is that hating people is inconsistent with the gospel. Hating people is inconsistent with the gospel. Jesus hates sin. He hates it. He hates it. But he loves sinners. And here's what's interesting. Jesus hated sin so much that he experienced pain and death in order to eradicate it. Let me say it one more time. Jesus hates sin so much that he was willing to experience pain and death in order to eradicate it. Here's what happens. There's hating people. When you hate someone, here's what happens. You desire to inflict pain on them, right? When you hate someone, you desire to inflict pain on them. Anybody in here ever been hurt? Anybody ever been hurt? You know it? Yeah, absolutely. You've been hurt, and then what did you do? You went home and you stewed on it, and you had some of those imaginary conversations to yourself. You said, well, if I see them again, or if I see them do this, and you just begin to imagine everything that you're going to do. Why? Because in hate, you want to inflict pain. But here's what happens. In love, when you're loving people, when you're forgiving people, instead of inflicting pain in order to inspire healing because of their darkness of their heart, you're willing to accept pain. Did you catch that? When you hate, you want to inflict pain. When you love and forgive, you're saying, I'm willing to accept pain in order to make this go away. And that's exactly what Jesus did for us. He calls us to model that character. I was talking to a doctor who worked in a trauma center of University Hospital, and you know this, University Hospital, if you're in a car wreck or God forbid that you have a gunshot wound or anything like that, you want to go to University Hospital because they do an excellent job with trauma. And so people come in from all types of things, car wrecks, gunshot wounds, accidents at home, they fall or something, even domestic violence. And as a doctor in this trauma center, this is what this particular doctor told me. He said, it's not up to me to pick and choose who I'm going to treat. He said, I'm a doctor. When they come in, I treat every person that comes in. It is my job to bring about healing in every person that comes in. And I think that we could take that as believers. As a doctor, they have one job, to do their best to bring about healing. Christians, you and I have one job, to do our very best to bring about healing. I want to ask you, what have you been saying over this past week? Does it bring about healing? I know you're angry. I know you're upset. Does it bring about healing? You are the doctor. You are the doctor. Jesus has given you hands. He's given you fingers to type messages online that bring about healing. You are the doctor, and we have been given one job, and that's not to pick and choose. Is to say, God, use me, whoever is in this world, to bring about healing regardless of what they have done. And so this morning, I want us to just very briefly look at John chapter 4. It's a good bit of verses, but I want us to just kind of take a look and identify God's truth this morning as He speaks to us. John chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 1. And I want us to kind of walk through our notes as well as we do this. And so I'm going to read verses 1 through 4 here. It says this: The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. Verse 3 says, Then when the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now, it was not Jesus' time to face the Pharisees. There's going to come a time that he's going to face the Pharisees, and eventually they're going to crucify him because he faces them. But then something happens in verse 4. It says this: Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given his son Joseph. Verse 6 says, Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour. That meant that it was about 12 o'clock. It's about noon, okay? In verse 7, something interesting happens. It says, When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, Will you give me a drink? For his disciples had gone into town to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Now, I want us to understand, this was crazy what was going on. Essentially what happens is, Jesus is in the area of Judah where Jerusalem is. Back in the Old Testament, after the reign of King Solomon, there was a dispute, there was a civil war that took place, and the kingdom of Israel split, okay? And one went north, and they remained with the name Israel. And then one went south, and they took on the name Judah. And Judah was where Jerusalem was. It's where Bethlehem is. It's where all those cities is. So you've got Israel in the north, and you've got Judah in the south. Well, here's what happened. Over time, Israel became disobedient to God. And what happened is God allowed the Assyrians in 722 BC to take the nation of Israel and deport them. Okay, so you've got this northern kingdom, and they're being deported, right? All right, then later on, the nation of Judah was also disobedient to God, and God allowed the next nation, Babylon, to come in and deport them. Now, here's what happened during that time period. Israel, when they were deported, that northern kingdom, when they were deported, what happened is the Assyrians brought in all these different nations. Now, they kind of left the poor people. They left the folks to kind of tend the land of the Israelites. But they brought in all these other nations, okay, and put them where Israel was. Well, over time, what happened is the people that were still kind of left in the area of Israel began to intermarry with these folks and have relationships with them. And so essentially what had happened over 100 years, about 750 years from that time, is there began to have what I would call tenderly a mixed breed of Jews, okay? You'd have them, they were a mixed breed of all these other different types of nations. So that's going on in Israel. Later on, the Samaria was their capital. Then in Judah, what happened was they were deported to Babylon. But what happened was there was a kingdom change. The Medes and Persians came and took over Babylon. And what happened was you had King Cyrus over the Persians allowed a lot of these Israelites to come back. So you have two situations. You've got one where they're deported and they're not allowed to come back. You have all these other people that come in. Then you have the nation of Judah comes in and they are deported, but then they're allowed to come back and rebuild the temple. So you still got this drift of everything that is taking place, of everything that is going on. And here's what I want us to understand. Here's why the Samaritan woman looked at Jesus weird, is because normally people in Samaria, Samaria's kind of right here in the middle, normally what would happen is if you were a Jew, you wouldn't go through Samaria to go north where Jesus was going. You would actually, they hated him so much, they would go around. They would actually cross the Jordan River and go around in order that they might go to the north. Now, we're not like that. We don't avoid certain places, do we? We don't avoid certain places in our city, do we? Because of a certain group of people. No, we would never do that. And so here's what happens is you've got these Jews who hated the Samaritans. Listen to this. Because of their race. The Jews hated the Samaritans because of their race. And listen to this. The Samaritans hated the Jews because of their position. Does that sound like today? The Jews hated the Samaritans because of their race. The Samaritans hated the Jews because of their position. They were allowed to come back. In fact, did you know this? When they came back to rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls around Jerusalem, when the Persian king Cyrus let them come back, the Samaritans actually came in and said, "Do you want some help?" Now they had a mindset, they weren't really there to help, they kind of wanted to infiltrate. And the people from Judea said, "Absolutely not, we don't need your help." There's been resentment ever since. And so I want us to see in this moment that you have all of this going on. And so I want you to write this down as we identify God's truth. The love of Jesus bridges our differences. The love of Jesus bridges our differences. As we look in verse 9, the Samaritan woman says to him, "What are you doing, man? You're a Jew and you're talking to me, a Samaritan woman." And there was even this rift between men and women. You aren't supposed to talk to women. And so the Jews hated the Samaritans because of their race. The Samaritans hated the Jews because of their position. And Jesus builds a bridge with this woman. Jesus is in the business of building bridges even in our nation today. And I want us to be reminded that He wants to use you and me to build that bridge. It goes on in John chapter 4 as we look into verse 10. Look at verse 10 right here. It says, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked Him and He would have given you living water." In verse 11 it says, "Sir," this woman said, "you have nothing to draw and the well is deep. Where can you get this quote unquote living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and flocks and herds?" Look at what Jesus answers in verse 13. Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water that I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water that I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." I love this because when we're out in front of our parking lot, we're handing out bottles of water. We've been doing it all week long with the group from Tennessee. This is one of the lines that we use with them. We say, "Look, this bottle of water will run out. It will no longer refresh you. But there is a relationship through Jesus Christ that He is calling living water, and it will refresh you forever." And Jesus wants to give that to her. But what's interesting here, it starts in verse 15. Look at verse 15. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water." Now, she doesn't realize he's not talking about physical water. She says, "Give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to come here to draw water." And Jesus meets her in the midst of everything that's going on. And he says, "Go and call your husband and come back." And now it's on, verse 17. "I have no husband," she replied. And Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say that you have no husband." He looks into her heart. He looks into her life. You can't hide anything from Jesus, because what happens in verse 18 says, "The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man that you have now is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." And here's what I want you to write down next. The love of Jesus not only bridges our differences, but the love of Jesus bridges our disgrace. This woman was in shame. So much shame. Did you remember when she came out? The Bible says that she goes out at the 6th hour, which means that it was 12 noon. Now let me ask you a question. If you're going to do any of your yard work, if you're going to do anything outside, let's just talk about this good old lovely New Orleans weather. Do you want to do any yard work outside at high noon? No, absolutely not. You don't want to do any work at high noon. Well, it's very similar here. You got a lot of water, you got a lot of humidity, you got all those things going on. Why in the world is this woman going out at high noon? Here's when women went out to draw water. They went in the morning and they went in the evening. So why is this woman going out at high noon? It's because she's ashamed. She's an outcast. She doesn't want anyone to see her. She's trying to avoid people. And Jesus, in the midst of her trying to avoid people, gets in the midst of her life, gets in the midst of her junk, and even begins to call her out and says, "Yes, you've had 5 husbands." And what he does is he bridges this disgrace that she has. This lady was a hot mess and everybody knew it. She felt like an outcast, not just to the Jews, but to her own village. She was looking for love in all the wrong places, same situations, different faces. 5 different husbands. And if Jesus wanted to burn this bridge with her, he would have been absolutely justified. He was God. He was perfect in everything that he did. And in the midst of that, she had taken this life that he had given her. He created her, right? And she had squandered it. I mean, didn't Jesus had the right to obliterate her or chew her out? And we see that even in our day and age, if someone or something is broken and no longer needed, what do we tend to do? We tend to throw it away. I had an amp in my house that I was using to power some speakers over this past summer, and it just wasn't working anymore. The speakers were crackling and all this kind of stuff, and I had this big expensive amp, and I said, "You know what, I'm done with this. I am so sick of this. This thing won't work, this piece of garbage." And you know what I did? I took it out to my trash can and I threw it away. I said, "I'm done with it." And you know what I did? I went out and bought a new one. Jesus doesn't do that with us. Jesus doesn't say, "You know what, this person has committed that sin, they've committed this hate crime, they've done this, they've done that. I'm sick, I'm done, I'm gonna throw them away." Now that Jesus has come on the scene, and now that he has died on the cross, he is all about loving them. And I think the sin of hate is very similar. I was thinking about this, to the sin of lust, in that it makes a human being into an object rather than a person created by the image of God. Just like lust. Lust takes a person, makes them an object. Hate takes that person and makes them an object. Go call your husband. I've had 5 husbands. And then what's interesting, I want you to go ahead and just write this down as we identify God's truth. The love of Jesus bridges our distance. So it bridges our differences. It bridges our disgrace, our shame. But then the love of Jesus bridges our distance. Look at this. This is interesting of what happens. He says, "Go call your husband." What you have no husband. You're quite true. And then in verse 19, she completely changes gears and changes the subject. Have you ever been called to the carpet on something that you did, and then it's awkward? Awkward situation, awkward conversation. What's going to happen? What's she doing? And so she just throws it in a different gear. She throws it in reverse and says, hey, I've got a question for you. You sound like a prophet. She is changing the subject because he's hit a soft spot of her heart. And this is what happens in verse 19. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. And then in verse 21, Jesus declared, believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Verse 23 says, yet a time is coming and is now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers that the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship him in spirit and truth. She goes back to this racism. She goes back to what's going on. She goes back and she's changing the subject, but she's still talking about the distance. She says, listen, we've got this place of worship, which is Mount Gerizim. You have this place of worship, which is the temple in Jerusalem. Which one should we go to? The Jews say that we can only worship in Jerusalem, but we're not allowed to go there. The Samaritans say we have to worship on Mount Gerizim. We can't go to Jerusalem. And so there's this constant battle of where should we go and worship? Do you see the drift? Do you see the distance that had been taking place for years and years? We have this distance even in our day and age now. White churches, black churches. We have different areas that in our minds we have different cliques in the church. We say, I can't do this or I can't do that. Some churches that I've been to, some people have territory in the church. I remember there was one church in particular that I came to. I said, I'm just going to lay down puppy pads all over everything because everybody's marking their territory. I remember thinking that. Everybody's got their territory. There's distance everywhere. The love of Jesus bridges even our distance. And worship, he says, you know what? A time is coming. It's almost here. Jesus is about to die on the cross within just a few years from this. He says, lady, a time is coming, and it's now come where the true worshipers aren't going to worship on this mountain or that mountain or in this church or in that church or going to have part of this ministry or that ministry. He says the true worshipers, which by the way, God is seeking. His eyes are looking all over the earth for true worshipers. He says the true worshipers that God is seeking is no longer designated by a place or a ministry or a type of church. He says the true worshipers that God is seeking are the ones that worship him in spirit, through the power of the Holy Spirit working in their lives, and in truth. They worship him in spirit and truth, and that's another sermon all on itself, but I just want you to hear, you can take spirit, God's spirit, and truth anywhere you want to go. It crosses races, it crosses socioeconomic status, it crosses all of these different barriers. He says, you can worship me wherever. That's the type that God is seeking. And so then he goes on. And the woman says, I know that the Messiah, she's looking for it. She says, you know what? I know that there's a Messiah coming called the Christ. And when he comes, he'll explain everything to us. In verse 26, Jesus declared, I who speak to you am. And in Greek, this is great. It doesn't say I am he, although that's what many of our Bibles says. It says, I am. I am. Do you remember the burning bush? Moses said, when I go to Pharaoh, who do I say sent me? And in Greek it says, I am. Jesus declared himself the I am. And I believe that this woman right here talks about later how she goes and tells the whole town what God has done. I believe that she got saved. I believe that he worked in her heart and worked in her life. And as I was thinking about this, how God used this, and I think about how there's so many walls and not bridges even in our society today. I came across a story of a pastor that I just want to use to kind of wrap up as we kind of go into a time of invitation. There was a pastor who had a brother who was a missionary in Germany. Now this is back in the 80s, early 90s, and he had this brother who was in Germany during that time. And so he said, I always loved to get packages from my brother in Germany. Send him chocolate, you know, all that German chocolate. that good stuff. He said, one day a package came in the mail, and I opened up this package. And I began to look down this package, and as he looks at it, he said, when I opened it up, I found a bit of odd-colored crumbling masonry, speckled with reds and blues. He said, I began to look at it for a moment. And as I looked at this ceramic masonry, I couldn't figure out what it was, but it was crumbling. It was falling apart. And as he looked at it, he began to think, you know what? Did the mailman like squish this? Did someone kick this? Was this originally like a pot or a ceramic vase or something? And he said as he began to look at it closer, he said that he realized what it was. He said it was a broken, crumbling piece of the Berlin Wall. A wall that had been used to divide a city, divide the German people for all this time. And he said that during this time, he that remembered what had happened only weeks earlier in Germany. The Berlin Wall came down, and a city that had been divided for decades was now reunited. And what's interesting is he gave him this ugly hunk of rock, which had now become a trophy. This ugly hunk of rock had now become a trophy. And this is a story, and when I think about this story, I think about a two-sided, disunified relationship, and yet this one piece is being used as a trophy. And I think about what's going on in our nation right now, and as horrible as it is, what if we prayed? We said, God, in the midst of this nasty mess, hunk of rock that you can't do anything with, but it looks like a paperweight, God, in the midst of this garbage, in the midst of this mess, would you make this season a trophy of your grace? Would you tear down the walls and build bridges like what we have been talking about? Bridges that bridge our differences and disgrace in our differences. God, would you bring about that where we hate sin, but never the person? Let's ask God that despite everything that's going on, to bring about a time that it would be a trophy of His grace. Let's bow and have a word of prayer. Father,